In the harsh wilderness of 1880s Wyoming territory, Eleanor McCrae thought her days of motherhood had passed her by. At 48, recently widowed and unexpectedly carrying her first child, she managed her homestead with quiet determination. Then a traveling peddler brought news that would change everything, a story of an 18-year-old boy sold by his own mother for the price of whiskey in a distant mining town. Eleanor had seen enough cruelty in her years to know when someone needed saving. When she found Levigant, bruised, but carrying himself with stubborn prédage, saw something that stirred her heart in ways she hadn't expected. What started as simple Christian charity soon became something deeper as winter settled over their land, and the boy proved himself with calloused hands and unwavering loyalty. But what dark secrets was Levi carrying from his past that would test everything Eleanor believed about family and forgiveness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McCrae homestead as Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. At 48, she had long resigned herself to a childless life, accepting it as God's will after years of disappointed hopes. Samuel's death 6 months ago had left her with more than grief. It had left her with this unexpected miracle growing inside her, conceived in their final tender months together. She twisted Samuel's wedding ring on her finger, the gold band worn smooth from 23 years of marriage. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to remove it. The weight of it reminded her of his steady presence, his gentle hands that had built this homestead from nothing but prairie grass and determination. Those same hands had held hers the night before he passed, whispering promises about the child they would finally have together. The homestead stretched across 200 acres of Wyoming territory, carved from land that had seemed impossible to tame. Samuel had chosen this spot for its natural windbreak of cottonwoods and the creek that ran year-round, providing water for livestock and the kitchen garden that now sustained Eleanor through the long months alone. The house itself was modest but solid, 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as kitchen and parlor, and a root cellar that Samuel had dug deep enough to store vegetables through the harshest winters. Eleanor's daily routine had become a meditation on survival. She rose before dawn to tend the chickens, milk the 2 cows, and gather eggs for breakfast. The physical demands of homestead life had only grown more challenging as her pregnancy progressed, but she had learned to adapt, to work smarter rather than harder. Samuel had taught her to read the weather, to prepare for the brutal Wyoming winters that could last from October through April, burying the homestead in snow and cutting them off from the nearest town for months at a time. Her nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 3 miles south, and while they checked on her weekly, Eleanor treasured her solitude. She had always been comfortable with her own company, finding peace in the rhythm of daily chores and the vast silence of the prairie. But lately, as her belly grew rounder, and the reality of raising a child alone settled over her, the silence felt heavier, more profound. Samuel had been her anchor, her partner in every sense. He had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but a wagon, 2 oxen, and dreams of building something lasting. Eleanor had met him in the territorial capital, where she worked as a seamstress for the wives of government officials. Their courtship had been brief but intense, 2 people who recognized in each other the kind of steadfast character needed to survive on the frontier. Their marriage had been built on mutual respect and shared hardship. Through droughts that killed their first crops, through winters that froze their water barrels solid, through the loneliness that could drive some settlers to madness, they had supported each other with unwavering devotion. The only shadow on their happiness had been Eleanor's inability to conceive. They had tried for years, consulting doctors when they could afford it, praying fervently, accepting each monthly disappointment with grace they didn't always feel. When Eleanor finally conceived at 47, it had seemed like a miracle and a curse combined. The joy was tempered by Samuel's declining health, the cough that had started as a minor irritation and gradually consumed his strength until he could barely work the land he loved. He had lived just long enough to feel the baby's first movements, to place his work-roughened palm against Eleanor's belly and whisper, "Our little fighter." Now, 3 months after Samuel's death, Eleanor faced the prospect of single motherhood with a mixture of determination and terror. She had enough savings to last through the winter if she was careful, and the homestead provided most of what she needed. But raising a child alone in this harsh country would test every skill Samuel had taught her. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her morning reverie. Eleanor looked out to see a familiar figure approaching Jake Morrison, the traveling peddler who made his rounds through the scattered homesteads twice a year. His wagon was loaded with the essentials that homesteaders couldn't produce themselves: salt, sugar, coffee, tools, fabric, and news from the outside world. Jake was a weathered man in his 60s, his face deeply lined from decades of frontier sun and wind. His wagon bore the scars of countless journeys across rough terrain, but his horses were well cared for and his goods were always fairly priced. More than that, Jake served as the unofficial newspaper for isolated families, carrying letters, messages, and stories from one homestead to another. Eleanor stepped onto her front porch, pulling her shawl tight against the morning chill. "Jake Morrison, you're a sight for sore eyes. Coffee's hot if you've got time." Jake's weathered face cracked into a smile as he climbed down from his wagon. "Mrs. McCrae, I always have time for your coffee. And I reckon you could use some company about now." His eyes took in her obvious pregnancy with the tactful awareness of a man who had seen every kind of human situation in his travels. They settled at Eleanor's kitchen table, steam rising from their cups, as Jake unpacked news from his travels. He spoke of families he'd visited, crops that had failed or flourished, new settlers arriving with the spring, and the gradual changes coming to Wyoming territory as it moved closer to statehood. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice growing more serious. "Something that's been weighing on my mind since I passed through Copper Ridge 2 weeks back." He reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. "There's a situation there that doesn't sit right with me. A boy, a teen, maybe 19 years old, being treated worse than a dog by his own kin." Eleanor felt her heart tighten. She had seen too much cruelty in her life to be shocked by human nature, but stories of children suffering always affected her deeply. "What kind of situation?" Jake's jaw worked as if the words tasted bitter. "His mother and I use that term loosely. She's taken to drink something fierce since her husband died in the mines. This boy, Levi's his name, he's been working like a mule to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. But it's never enough for her. She beats him when she's drunk, which is most days now, and she's been making noise about needing to get some use out of him." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew. "Word is she's been talking to some of the mine foremen about selling his labor contract. Basically selling her own son into indentured servitude for however much whiskey money she can get." Jake's voice carried the disgust of a man who had seen the worst of frontier life. "The boy's got nowhere to go, no family willing to take him in. He's trapped there, working himself to death for a woman who sees him as nothing more than a burden." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of anger and protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Perhaps it was her pregnancy, the maternal instincts awakening as her body prepared to nurture life. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition of need that Samuel had always said was her greatest strength and weakness combined. "Where exactly is Copper Ridge?" she asked quietly. Jake's eyes sharpened. 2 days hard ride northeast. "Why do you ask?" Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the horizon. Samuel had always said that God put people in each other's paths for a reason. She had dismissed it as his simple faith, but now she wondered if there might be truth in it. "A boy shouldn't have to live like that," she said finally. "No, he shouldn't," Jake agreed, "but there's precious little anyone can do about it legally. She's his mother, and the law gives her rights over him until he's 21. assuming he lives that long. Eleanor turned back to face Jake, her decision crystallizing with each word she spoke. What if someone were to offer her money for him? Not for his labor contract, but to take him away from there entirely. Jake stared at her for a long moment. Eleanor, you can't be serious. You're carrying a child. You're alone here, and you're talking about taking in a complete stranger, a grown man who's been living rough for who knows how long. I'm serious as the grave, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had seen her through 23 years of frontier life. That boy needs help, and she paused, one hand moving to her belly. I have room in my home and my heart for someone who needs both. Jake shook his head slowly, but Eleanor could see the respect in his eyes. If you're set on this fool notion, I won't try to talk you out of it, but you need to know what you're getting into. This boy's been through hell, and hell leaves marks on a person. He might not be grateful for rescue, and he sure might not be easy to live with. I understand, Eleanor said, though she wondered if she truly did. Will you take me there? Jake drained his coffee cup and stood. I'll do better than that. I'll take you there, help you negotiate with his mother if that's what it comes to, and I'll make sure you get home safe. But Eleanor, he fixed her with a steady gaze, promise me you'll think hard about this. Some kinds of damage can't be fixed with kindness and good intentions. Eleanor nodded, already planning what she would need for the journey. Some damage can't be fixed at all, Jake, but sometimes, just sometimes, it can be healed. And even if it can't, no child should face it alone. As Jake prepared to leave, promising to return in 2 days with supplies for the journey, Eleanor found herself standing at Samuel's grave behind the house. The simple wooden cross bore his name and the dates of his life, along with the words she had chosen. He built with love what endures beyond time. I don't know if this is wisdom or foolishness, Samuel, she whispered to the wind that stirred the prairie grass around his resting place. But something tells me this boy needs us as much as we might need him. And if there's one thing you taught me, it's that family isn't always born sometimes, it's chosen. The wind carried her words across the vast landscape, and for a moment, Eleanor could almost hear Samuel's voice in its whisper. Trust your heart, my love. It's never led you wrong. That evening, as Eleanor sat by her fireplace, mending clothes and planning for the journey ahead, she felt the baby move strongly within hers, if in approval of the decision she had made. She placed her hand over the movement and smiled, imagining the child she would soon hold and the young man she hoped to save. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the homestead with its familiar sounds of wind and wildlife. But for the first time since Samuel's death, Eleanor didn't feel alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and perhaps new heartbreak, but it would also bring the possibility of family, of purpose beyond mere survival, of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. Jake's return 2 days later brought with it the supplies Eleanor had requested and the grim determination of a man who had agreed to help despite his better judgment. Eleanor had spent the intervening time preparing the homestead for her absence, arranging with the Hendersons to check on the livestock, and wrestling with doubts that visited her in the quiet hours before dawn. But as Jake's wagon rolled away from the homestead with Eleanor seated beside him, her small travel bag packed with essentials and her heart full of hope and fear in equal measure, she knew there was no turning back. Somewhere ahead lay a boy who needed saving, and Eleanor McCrae had never been one to turn away from need, no matter the cost to herself. The journey to Copper Ridge stretched through 2 days of rough terrain and autumn weather that hinted at the harsh winter to come. Eleanor's pregnancy made the travel uncomfortable, but she endured the jolting wagon and cold nights with the stoic acceptance that frontier life had taught her. Jake proved to be excellent company, sharing stories of his travels and asking thoughtful questions about her plans for the boy she hoped to help. As they crested the final hill before Copper Ridge, Eleanor got her first glimpse of the mining town that had produced so much misery. The settlement hugged a narrow valley, its buildings grimy with coal dust and its streets churned into mud by constant traffic. The sound of the mines carried even to their elevated position, the rhythmic pounding of machinery, and the shouts of men working in dangerous conditions for wages that barely sustained life. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked, as they began their descent into town. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the baby shift restlessly within her. As ready as anyone can be for walking into someone else's nightmare. The mining town of Copper Ridge existed for one purpose: extracting coal from the earth as quickly and cheaply as possible. The company that owned the mines also owned most of the buildings, the general store, and the saloon, where miners spent their wages on whiskey that dulled the pain of their dangerous work. It was in this saloon that Eleanor first laid eyes on the woman who had birthed Levi and was now selling him to the highest bidder. Martha Thornton sat at a corner table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before her, and the vacant stare of someone who had long since given up on life. She was perhaps 40 years old, but looked 60, her face ravaged by alcohol and bitterness. When Jake approached her table and mentioned Levi's name, her eyes sharpened with the calculating look of a person who saw opportunity in every conversation. "What's it to you?" she slurred, squinting at Eleanor with suspicious eyes. "You ain't from around here." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized the true depth of degradation she was witnessing. This woman showed no maternal instinct, no concern for her son's welfare, only the predatory awareness of someone looking to make a deal. "I understand you're looking to make arrangements for your son," Eleanor said carefully, choosing her words to avoid triggering the woman's defenses. Martha laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Arrangements? That's a fancy way of putting it. Boy's been nothing but trouble since his father died. Eats too much, works too little, and thinks he's better than the hand that feeds him." Eleanor exchanged glances with Jake, who wore an expression of barely controlled disgust. "Where is Levi now?" "Working the Brennan place, doing odd jobs for scraps," Martha replied, taking another drink. "But old Brennan can't keep him much longer. Boy needs a firm hand and steady work, if you understand my meaning." The negotiation that followed was one of the most distasteful conversations Eleanor had ever endured. Martha Thornton spoke of her son as if he were livestock, discussing his strength, his work capacity, and his value in terms that made Eleanor's stomach turn. But Eleanor endured it, haggling over a price that would secure Levi's freedom while trying not to reveal how desperately she wanted to remove him from this situation. When they finally agreed on a sum $25, more money than Eleanor had spent on anything since Samuel's funeral, Martha's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "You'll find him at the Brennan place, half a mile up the Ridge Road. But don't expect gratitude, boys got no respect for authority." Eleanor left the saloon with Martha's grudging agreement and Jake's worried support. But her real test was yet to come. Finding Levi would be one thing. Convincing him to trust her would be another entirely. The Brennan place was a small farm carved from the hillside above the mining town, its fields brown with autumn stubble and its buildings weathered by mountain winters. Eleanor found Levi behind the barn, splitting firewood with methodical precision, despite the obvious exhaustion that marked his every movement. Her first glimpse of him confirmed everything Jake had told her, and worse. Levi was tall and lean, but with the unhealthy thinness of someone who worked hard and ate little. His clothes were patched and dirty, his hands bore the calluses and scars of constant labor, and his face carried the guarded expression of someone who expected nothing good from life. The torn shirt he wore was stained with blood from recent injuries, and Eleanor could see the careful way he moved that spoke of pain he was trying to hide. When he looked up and saw Eleanor approaching, his body tensed like a wild animal preparing to flee or fight. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Are you Levi Thornton?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. His eyes narrowed. "Depends who's asking." Eleanor felt her heart break a little at the wariness in his voice, the automatic suspicion of someone who had learned that most human contact brought pain. "My name is Eleanor McCrae. I've been speaking with your mother about your situation." Levi's face went white, then flushed with anger. "What situation, and what business is it of yours?" "The business of someone who thinks an 18-year-old boy deserves better than being sold off like cattle." Eleanor replied, her voice gentle but firm. For a moment, Levi's composure cracked, and Eleanor saw the frightened young man beneath the hardened exterior. Then his walls went back up, stronger than before. "I don't need charity from strangers," he said, turning back to his woodpile. "This isn't charity," Eleanor said, stepping closer despite the warning in his posture. "This is an offer of work, room and board, and the chance to make something of yourself without looking over your shoulder." Levi's axe paused mid-swing. "What kind of work?" Eleanor described her homestead, the challenges of maintaining it alone while pregnant, and the honest work that needed doing. She spoke of dignity, of earning one's keep, of the possibility of building something lasting. As she talked, she watched Levi's expression shift from suspicion to cautious interest, to something that might have been hope. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully, knowing that her next words might determine whether she could save this young man or would have to leave him to his fate. "Because sometimes God puts people in our path for reasons we don't understand until much later," she said. "Because every person deserves the chance to show what they're made of when they're treated with respect. And because—" she paused, one hand moving to her belly. "Because I believe families can be chosen as well as born, and maybe we're both meant to find out what that looks like." Levi stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for deception or hidden motives. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, letting him see the sincerity of her offer and the depth of her determination to help him. "If I come with you," he said slowly, "it's as hired help. I earn my keep, I follow your rules, and I don't owe anybody anything beyond honest work." "Fair enough," Eleanor agreed, though her heart told her that the relationship between them would become far more complex than a simple employer-employee arrangement. The transaction with Martha Thornton was completed with indecent haste, the woman barely looking at her son as she pocketed Eleanor's money and declared herself shut of the ungrateful whelp. Levi's few possessions fit in a single bundle, and his goodbye to the only home he had ever known consisted of a brief nod to Mr. Brennan, who pressed a small package of food into his hands with genuine regret at losing such a capable worker. As Jake's wagon rolled away from Copper Ridge with Eleanor and Levi aboard, Eleanor felt the weight of what she had undertaken settling on her shoulders. She had brought a stranger into her life, someone whose past was largely unknown and whose future was entirely uncertain. The $25 she had paid represented a significant portion of her savings, money she had planned to use for supplies for the coming winter and preparations for the baby. But as she glanced at Levi, sitting rigidly upright beside her, with his bundle clutched in work-roughened hands, Eleanor felt a certainty that surprised her with its strength. This was right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever difficulties they would face in learning to trust each other, this decision felt as natural and necessary as breathing. The journey home took 3 days instead of 2, as Eleanor's pregnancy required more frequent stops, and Levi, despite his obvious exhaustion, insisted on walking beside the wagon whenever the terrain became rough. Jake observed this consideration with approval, noting to Eleanor during one of their evening camps that the boy showed the kind of instinctive courtesy that spoke well of his character. On their final night before reaching the homestead, as they sat around a small campfire under the vast Wyoming sky, Levi spoke more than he had during the entire journey. "I want you to know," he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames, "I'm not looking for a family. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me or feel sorry for me. I just want honest work and a place where I can earn my keep without—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Without being hurt," Eleanor said gently. Levi nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I don't know how to be around people who don't want something from me. I don't know how to live without waiting for the other shoe to drop." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "Then we'll both learn together," she said. "Because I don't know how to raise a child alone, or how to run a homestead without my husband's help, or how to trust that bringing you home was the right decision. But sometimes not knowing is just the beginning of figuring it out." The next morning brought their first glimpse of the McCrae homestead, and Eleanor watched Levi's face as he took in the neat buildings, the well-maintained fences, and the ordered landscape that she and Samuel had carved from the wilderness. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something like peace in his expression. "It's beautiful," he said simply, and Eleanor knew that despite all his protestations about not needing family, Levi Thornton was finally coming home. The first weeks of October brought unseasonably warm weather to the Wyoming Territory, a gift that allowed Eleanor and Levi to establish their new arrangement without the added pressure of harsh conditions. Eleanor had prepared a small room off the kitchen for Levi, furnished with a simple bed, a chest for his belongings, and a washstand that had belonged to Samuel. It wasn't much, but it was private and clean luxuries that Levi had never experienced. The transformation in Levi during those first weeks was subtle but unmistakable. Good food, regular sleep, and the absence of constant fear began to fill out his gaunt frame and ease the rigid tension that had marked his every movement in Copper Ridge. Eleanor watched him discover simple pleasures, the taste of fresh milk from their cows, the warmth of the kitchen on cool mornings, the satisfaction of work that was appreciated rather than exploited. Their daily routine developed naturally, shaped by the demands of the homestead and Eleanor's advancing pregnancy. Levi rose before dawn to tend the livestock, a task he approached with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that animals depended on consistent care. Eleanor found herself watching from the kitchen window as he moved among the cattle and horses, noting how quickly the animals accepted his presence and how gently he handled even the most stubborn creatures. After the morning chores, they would share breakfast at the kitchen table, simple meals of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread that Eleanor baked twice weekly. These meals were initially silent affairs, with Levi eating quickly and efficiently, while Eleanor struggled to make conversation with someone who seemed to expect every word to carry hidden meaning or threat. Gradually, as the days passed and no demands were made beyond honest work, Levi began to relax incrementally. Eleanor learned to be patient, to let silence fill the spaces between them without rushing to break it. She discovered that Levi was naturally observant, noticing when she struggled with heavy tasks and quietly taking over without being asked. When her back ached from standing too long at the stove, she would find him appearing at her elbow with a chair. When she dropped something and couldn't easily bend to retrieve it, his hand would be there before she could protest. The first real conversation between them came during the third week, as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by summer storms. Eleanor was holding fence posts steady while Levi secured them with wire, when she noticed him pausing to examine something in his hand. "What is it?" she asked. Levi held up a small piece of wood, roughly carved but recognizable as a horse. "I used to make these," he said quietly. "When I was younger before," he stopped, the familiar walls going up again. "Before things got difficult?" Eleanor prompted gently. Levi nodded, turning the carving over in his palm. "My father taught me. He was good with his hands, could make just about anything from wood. Said it was important to create beautiful things, even when life was ugly." Eleanor felt her heart ache for the loss she heard in his voice. "What happened to him?" "Mine accident. 3 years ago," Levi replied, his voice flat with old grief. "Cave in during the night shift. 5 men died, including him. After that, Ma." He shook his head. "Things changed." Eleanor understood. She had seen enough frontier tragedy to know how quickly circumstances could shift from manageable to desperate. The death of a breadwinner often meant the difference between survival and destitution, and some people responded to that pressure by becoming stronger, while others simply broke. "Would you like to use Samuel's tools?" she asked impulsively. He had a good collection in the barn workshop. He would have wanted them to be used by someone who appreciated craftsmanship. Levi looked up sharply, as if searching for the catch in her offer. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "I'd like that, thank you." That evening, Eleanor found Levi in the barn workshop, Samuel's tools laid out on the workbench as he examined each one with the reverence of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. He had already begun work on a new carving, his hands moving with a skill that spoke of natural talent refined by practice. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked from the doorway. Levi looked up, and for the first time since she had known him, he almost smiled. "A horse for your baby," he said. "Every child should have a toy that's made with love." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple generosity of the gesture. This young man, who had been treated as nothing more than a burden by his own mother, was already thinking about the well-being of her unborn child. The hand-carved wooden horse was taking shape under his skilled fingers, each detail crafted with care that spoke of genuine affection for a child he had never met. "That's very thoughtful," she managed to say around the tightness in her throat. Levi ducked his head, embarrassed by her emotion. "It's just wood," he muttered. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "It's much more than that." As the days shortened and the first hints of winter appeared in the morning frost, Eleanor found herself marveling at how seamlessly Levi had integrated into the rhythms of homestead life. He seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what needed to be done and when, taking initiative without overstepping boundaries. The barn had never been better organized, the livestock had never been better cared for, and the endless list of maintenance tasks that kept a homestead functioning was being systematically addressed with quiet competence. More importantly, Eleanor began to see glimpses of the young man Levi might have become if circumstances had been different. When he thought she wasn't watching, she sometimes caught him smiling at the antics of the barn cats or talking softly to the horses as he groomed them. His natural gentleness, suppressed by years of harsh treatment, was slowly emerging in safe moments when his guard was down. The neighbors' reactions to Levi's presence were mixed but generally positive. When Martha Henderson stopped by for her weekly visit, she observed Levi working on roof repairs with an approving eye. "He's a good worker," she told Eleanor as they watched him from the kitchen window. "Knows what he's about, and he's respectful. But Eleanor, you need to be careful. You don't really know anything about his past beyond what that peddler told you." Eleanor appreciated Martha's concern, but she felt increasingly confident in her decision. "I know enough," she replied. "I know he's kind to animals, careful with tools, and considerate of others. I know he works hard without complaint and asks for nothing beyond basic fairness. Sometimes that tells you more about a person's character than a complete history." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe so. But if you ever need anything, if there's ever any trouble, you know James and I are just 3 miles south." Eleanor was grateful for the support, even as she hoped it would never be necessary. She was beginning to understand that Levi's presence in her life was filling needs she hadn't even realized she had. Not just the practical assistance with heavy work, but the simple comfort of another human presence in the long hours of prairie solitude. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, Eleanor discovered Levi sitting by the kitchen fire, carefully working on the wooden horse by lamplight. The toy was nearly finished now, polished smooth and detailed, with a flowing mane and expressive eyes that gave it personality and life. "May I see it?" she asked. Levi hesitated, then held out the carving for her inspection. Eleanor took it reverently, running her fingers over the smooth wood and admiring the skill that had created something so beautiful from a simple block of timber. "This is extraordinary work," she said honestly. "Your father taught you well." "He used to say that every piece of wood had something beautiful inside it," Levi replied quietly. "The carver's job was just to find it and set it free." Eleanor handed the horse back to him, struck by the poetry in those words and the evidence they provided of the man who had shaped Levi's early years. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Levi agreed. "He taught me that work was something to be proud of, no matter what kind it was, as long as you did it with integrity. He said a man's character wasn't measured by what he owned, but by how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him." Eleanor nodded, thinking of Samuel and how similar his philosophy had been. "Your father and my husband would have understood each other well." "I think so too," Levi said. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he had lived, if we could have left the mining town and found a place like this." "Maybe that's what this is," Eleanor suggested gently. Maybe this is the life he dreamed of for you, just coming to you in a different way than either of you expected. Levi was quiet for a long moment, turning the wooden horse in his hands as he considered her words. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression, a tentative hope that hadn't been there before. "Do you really think so?" he asked. "I think your being here proves that sometimes good things can come from the worst circumstances," Eleanor replied. "And I think any father would be proud to see his son turning out to be the kind of man you're becoming." The compliment clearly affected Levi deeply. He looked down at the carving in his hands, and Eleanor could see him struggling with emotions that had no easy outlet. Finally, he cleared his throat and stood. "I should check on the animals one more time before bed," he said, his voice slightly rough. Eleanor nodded, understanding his need for a moment, alone, to process their conversation. "Thank you, Levi, for everything you do, and for being here." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you for giving me the chance," he said simply, then stepped out into the autumn night. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The homestead felt different, now less empty, more purposeful. The sound of another person moving through the morning routine, the knowledge that capable hands were caring for things she could no longer manage easily, the simple pleasure of sharing meals and conversations with someone who was becoming less of a stranger and more of what. She wasn't quite ready to use the word family, but something was definitely growing between them, something that felt right and necessary and good. Outside her window, she could hear Levi making his final rounds, checking latches and securing the barn for the night. The sounds were comforting, domestic, and filled with the promise of tomorrow's shared work and gradual understanding. Whatever challenges winter might bring, Eleanor no longer felt as though she would face them alone. As November settled over the Wyoming territory, with its promise of harsh winter ahead, Eleanor found herself increasingly grateful for Levi's presence. The young man had thrown himself into preparing the homestead for the months of isolation that lay ahead, working with a methodical determination that impressed even the experienced neighbors who stopped by to check on Eleanor's progress. The transformation in their relationship during these weeks was subtle but profound. What had begun as a formal arrangement between employer and hired hand was evolving into something that resembled genuine companionship. Eleanor discovered that Levi possessed not only physical strength and work ethic, but also a quick intelligence and dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt safe enough to let his guard down. Their evening routine had become particularly precious to Eleanor. After supper and the completion of daily chores, they would settle in the main room where Eleanor worked on quilting, while Levi either carved or struggled through the books from Samuel's small library. Eleanor had begun teaching him to read beyond the basic level he had achieved through sporadic schooling, and his progress was remarkable. "This word," Levi said one evening, pointing to a passage in Samuel's worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, "I can't make sense of it." Eleanor looked over his shoulder at the text. "Providential. It means relating to divine providence, God's protective care and guidance." Levi sounded out the word carefully, then read the entire sentence aloud. It seemed providential that the ship should be cast upon this shore. He paused, considering. Like it was meant to happen, even though it seemed like bad luck at first? "Exactly," Eleanor said, impressed by his grasp of the concept. "Sometimes what appears to be misfortune can lead to unexpected blessings." Levi was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about more than just the story. "Do you think that's what happened to me? Coming here, I mean?" Eleanor set down her quilting and gave him her full attention. "What do you think?" "I think," Levi hesitated, then continued with careful honesty, "I think if my father hadn't died, if my mother hadn't taken to drink, I never would have met you. I would have stayed in Copper Ridge, probably worked the mines until they killed me like they killed him. I never would have known that places like this existed, or that people could be—" He struggled for the right word. "Kind," Eleanor suggested gently. "Kind," he agreed, "but more than that, fair, respectful, like they see you as a person worth something, not just a pair of hands to do work. Eleanor felt her heart warm at his words, but also ache for the years of poor treatment that made simple human decency seem remarkable to him. You are worth something, Levi. You're worth a great deal. Levi ducked his head, still uncomfortable with praise, but Eleanor could see that her words pleased him. She had learned to be patient with his difficulty accepting kindness, understanding that years of cruelty had taught him to be suspicious of any positive attention. The quilting project that occupied Eleanor's evenings was particularly significant, a baby quilt made from fabric that had belonged to her mother and grandmother. The quilt represented generations of women who had created homes and raised families under challenging circumstances, and Eleanor found deep meaning in adding her own stitches to the family legacy. "Tell me about this pattern," Levi asked one evening, studying the intricate design taking shape under Eleanor's skilled hands. "It's called wedding ring," Eleanor explained, showing him how the interlocking circles created an overall pattern of connection and continuity. "My mother taught it to me when I was young. She said each ring represented the bonds between family members, and the way they overlap shows how families support each other through generations." Levi traced one of the completed rings with a careful finger. "It's beautiful. Your baby will be lucky to have something made with so much love." Eleanor paused in her stitching, struck by an impulse that surprised her. "Levi, would you like to help with it? You don't need to sew, but you could help me plan the arrangement of colors, or—" "I don't know anything about quilting," Levi interrupted, but Eleanor could hear interest in his voice despite his protest. "You know about creating beautiful things," Eleanor replied. "You proved that with the wooden horse. This is just a different medium." Over the following evenings, Levi became increasingly involved in the quilt project. His artist's eye proved invaluable in arranging colors and patterns, and his suggestions often improved Eleanor's original designs. More importantly, his participation seemed to represent a deeper level of investment in the family they were creating together. The work gave them opportunities for conversation that revealed more about both their pasts and their hopes for the future. Eleanor learned that Levi's father had been a thoughtful man who read to his son despite his own limited education, and who had encouraged Levi's artistic abilities even when practical concerns dominated their daily life. He used to say that beauty was what separated humans from animals. Levi told her as they worked together on a particularly intricate section of the quilt. Animals could build and make tools, but only humans created things that served no purpose except to be beautiful. "He sounds like a philosopher as well as a craftsman," Eleanor observed. "Maybe. He definitely saw things differently than most of the men in the mining camp. They thought he was soft for encouraging my carving and reading. But he said a man who couldn't appreciate beauty was only half alive." Eleanor nodded, thinking of Samuel and his own appreciation for the aesthetic elements of their homestead, the way he had positioned the house to take advantage of sunset views. His insistence on planting flowers around the front porch, despite their lack of practical value. His delight in the patterns frost made on their windows during winter mornings. "I think your father and Samuel would have been great friends," she said. "I wish they could have met," Levi replied wistfully. "I wish I could have met Samuel." "You are meeting him in a way," Eleanor said softly. "Through the things he built, the books he chose, the tools he used. He's still here in the care he put into this place." As the nights grew longer and colder, their evening routine expanded to include more personal sharing. Eleanor found herself telling Levi stories about her life with Samuel, their courtship, their struggles to establish the homestead, their disappointments and small triumphs. In return, Levi gradually opened up about his childhood before his father's death, painting a picture of a family that had been poor but loving, united by shared values and mutual respect. "We didn't have much," he said one evening as wind howled around the cabin, "but I never felt poor when my father was alive. He had a way of making everything seem like an adventure, even when we were eating beans for the third day running or patching holes in our roof." "That's a gift," Eleanor said, "the ability to find joy and meaning in simple things." "I lost that for a while," Levi admitted. "After he died, Everything just became about surviving another day. I forgot that life could be about more than just enduring. Eleanor looked up from her quilting to study his face in the firelight. And now? Levi was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the wooden bird he was carving another gift for the baby. "Now I'm starting to remember," he said finally. "Being here, working with you, having time to read and carve and think about things beyond just getting through it's like waking up from a long bad dream." The honesty in his voice moved Eleanor deeply. She could see the young man he was meant to be emerging from the shell of fear and hardship that had encased him for so long. His natural intelligence was flourishing under the encouragement of their reading sessions. His artistic skills were developing through access to proper tools and materials, and his capacity for trust was slowly expanding as he experienced consistent kindness. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor could see that Levi was beginning to hope again. Hope for a future beyond mere survival, hope for relationships based on mutual care rather than exploitation, hope that he might build something lasting and meaningful with his life. The first serious snowfall came in late November, transforming the homestead into a white wonderland that would remain largely unchanged until spring. As Eleanor watched Levi securing the livestock buildings and checking their winter supplies, she felt a deep satisfaction in their preparations. They were ready for the isolation and challenges that lay ahead, not just practically, but emotionally. Standing at her kitchen window with one hand resting on her growing belly, Eleanor reflected on how much their lives had changed since that autumn day when Jake Morrison had brought news of a boy in need. The lonely widow who had contemplated facing motherhood alone had become part of a family unit that felt natural and right despite its unconventional formation. The baby moved strongly within her, as if responding to her contentment, and Eleanor smiled as she imagined the spring that would bring new life to both their family and the land around them. Outside, Levi was splitting wood for their stove, his movements efficient and strong, and the sound of his work was a comforting reminder that she was no longer alone. Whatever challenges winter might bring, whatever tests lay ahead for their unusual family, Eleanor felt ready to face them with confidence. She had chosen well when she decided to rescue this young man, and he had chosen well when he decided to trust her offer of a new life. Together, they were creating something valuable and lasting, home built on mutual respect, growing affection, and the kind of love that transcends blood relationships to embrace the deeper bonds of chosen family. December brought the kind of winter that tested the resolve of even the most experienced homesteaders. Snow fell steadily for 3 days straight, piling against the barn doors and covering the fences until only their top rails showed above the white expanse. The wind howled across the prairie with a ferocity that made the cabin creak and groan, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the kitchen pitcher despite the constantly burning fire. Eleanor's pregnancy had reached the stage where even simple tasks required careful planning and frequent rest. Her belly had grown round and prominent, making it difficult to sleep comfortably and impossible to bend or reach as she once had. The baby moved constantly now, responding to sounds and her emotional state with kicks and turns that sometimes took her breath away. During these long, isolated days, the bond between Eleanor and Levi deepened into something that resembled the family relationship they had tentatively acknowledged. Levi had taken over virtually all the outdoor work, rising in the darkness before dawn to break ice on the water troughs, feed the livestock, and shovel paths between the buildings. Eleanor often watched from the kitchen window as he moved through these tasks with steady competence, marveling at how the frightened, suspicious young man she had found in Copper Ridge had transformed into someone she trusted completely. Samuel's rifle hung above the mantel, a constant reminder of the masculine presence that had once protected and provided for the homestead. Since Samuel's death, Eleanor had barely thought about the weapon, but Levi's presence had somehow made its significance more apparent. Not because she felt unsafe with him, but because she realized how much she had missed having someone who could serve as both companion and protector in this harsh land. One morning, as Levi returned from his dawn chores with ice crystals in his hair and his breath visible in the frigid air, Eleanor made a decision that surprised them both. "Levi," she said as he stamped snow from his boots by the door, "I want you to learn to use Samuel's rifle." Levi looked up sharply, his expression cautious. "Ma'am, this is dangerous country, especially in winter," Eleanor explained, moving carefully to the mantel and taking down the well-maintained weapon. "If something happened to me during the birth, if there were problems with wild animals or other dangers, you need to be able to protect yourself and the baby." Levi accepted the rifle with the reverence of someone who understood the responsibility it represented. "I've never used one before," he admitted. "Samuel taught me, and I'll teach you," Eleanor said firmly. "It's not just about shooting, it's about maintenance, safety, and knowing when not to use it as much as when to use it." Over the following days, despite the brutal weather, Eleanor taught Levi everything Samuel had taught her about firearms. They practiced loading and cleaning indoors, with Eleanor explaining the mechanics and Levi absorbing every detail with his characteristic focus. When the weather permitted, they went outside for actual shooting practice, with Levi proving to be a natural marksman whose steady hands and careful nature served him well. "You're a good teacher," Levi said one afternoon as they returned from a practice session, the rifle now feeling comfortable and familiar in his hands. "Samuel always said that teaching someone to handle a weapon properly was one of the most important gifts you could give them," Eleanor replied. "Not because violence is good, but because being able to protect what matters to you is part of being responsible for it." The lesson seemed to resonate with Levi on a deeper level. Eleanor noticed that his entire demeanor shifted slightly after he began carrying the rifle during his outdoor work, not with aggression or swagger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he could defend his family if necessary. The rifle became a symbol of his full integration into their domestic unit, a sign that Eleanor trusted him not just with chores and companionship, but with their very survival. Their daily routines had evolved into something that felt as natural as breathing. Eleanor would wake to the sounds of Levi already moving through the kitchen, building up the fire and preparing coffee. By the time she made her way from the bedroom, warmth would be spreading through the cabin and the morning meal would be underway. They worked together preparing breakfast with an efficiency born of practice and mutual consideration. "How did you sleep?" Levi would ask, noting if Eleanor seemed particularly tired or uncomfortable. "Well enough," she would reply, though they both knew that her advancing pregnancy made restful sleep increasingly elusive. These morning conversations became a cherished ritual, a gentle way of checking on each other's well-being and planning the day ahead. Eleanor found herself looking forward to them as much as any part of her day, appreciating not just Levi's practical concern, but the growing intimacy of two people who had learned to read each other's moods and needs. As her pregnancy progressed and her mobility became more limited, Eleanor found herself relying on Levi for tasks that went far beyond their original arrangement. He had learned to cook simple but nourishing meals when Eleanor was too tired to stand at the stove, and he somehow managed to anticipate her needs before she expressed them. When her back ached from the weight she carried, he would appear with cushions arranged just right. When she struggled to reach something, his hand would be there before she could ask for help. "You don't have to take care of me," Eleanor said one evening as Levi helped her settle into Samuel's chair with a cup of tea and a warm blanket. "Yes, I do," Levi replied simply. "You took care of me when I needed it. This is what families do for each other." The ease with which he used the word family no longer surprised Eleanor, but it still warmed her heart. Their relationship had evolved beyond any formal definition into something that felt both natural and precious, a bond, built on mutual care, shared work, and growing affection. Their evening conversations had deepened as well, moving beyond practical concerns to touch on hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. Eleanor learned that Levi possessed not just intelligence, but wisdom beyond his years, shaped by hardship but not embittered by it. His insights about people and situations often surprised her with their maturity and compassion. "What do you think about when you're working outside alone?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat by the fire, she with her quilting and he with a new carving project. Levi considered the question seriously. "Lots of things. Sometimes I think about my father, wondering what he would think of this place, of you, of the man I'm trying to become. Sometimes I think about the baby, what it will be like to help raise a child, to be part of watching someone grow up in a place where they're loved and safe." Eleanor's hands stilled on her quilting. "And what do you think about that?" "I think about how different their life will be from mine," Levi said quietly. "This baby will never know what it's like to go to bed hungry, or to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them, or to feel like they're nothing but a burden. That seems like the most wonderful thing in the world." The depth of emotion in his voice brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She could see that his investment in her unborn child went far beyond mere obligation or even affectionate, represented his chance to ensure that another young person would have the childhood he had been denied. "This baby is very lucky to have you in its life," Eleanor said softly. "I hope so," Levi replied. "I hope I can be good at it, being family to someone, helping to give them what they need to grow up strong and kind." "You're already good at it," Eleanor assured him. "Look at how you've become family to me." The winter nights seemed to encourage these deeper conversations, as if the isolation and intimacy of their shared space created a natural environment for emotional honesty. Eleanor found herself sharing memories and feelings with Levi that she had never voiced to anyone, while he gradually opened up about fears and hopes that had remained locked inside him since his father's death. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled around their cabin and snow pelted the windows, their conversation turned to the subject of names for the baby. "Have you thought about what you want to call him or her?" Levi asked, pausing in his carving to look at Eleanor with genuine curiosity. Eleanor set down her quilting and placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. "I've thought about it, but I haven't decided. Samuel and I used to talk about names sometimes, but we never thought we would actually need them." "What names did you consider?" "For a boy, we liked Thomas Samuel's father's name. For a girl, we thought about Grace, or maybe Rose." Eleanor paused, then added impulsively, "What do you think?" Levi seemed surprised to be consulted on such an important decision. "Me? I don't know anything about naming babies." "You know about this baby," Eleanor said gently. "You're going to be part of their life from the very beginning. Your opinion matters." Levi was quiet for a long moment, clearly taking the responsibility seriously. "Thomas is a good name," he said finally. "It was my father's name too. And Grace, that seems right for a child who's coming into a life full of love and plenty." Eleanor felt a strange tightness in her throat at his inclusion of his father's name in the discussion. The idea of naming her son after both Samuel's father and Levi's father seemed to perfectly capture the blended nature of the family they were creating. "Thomas it is, then, if it's a boy," she said. "And if it's a girl, maybe we could use both names, Grace Rose." "That's beautiful," Levi agreed, and Eleanor could see that being included in this decision meant more to him than he could easily express. As they settled into sleep that night, Eleanor in her bedroom and Levi on the narrow bed in his small room off the kitchen, both were thinking about the spring that would bring new life to their homestead and their family. Outside, the Wyoming winter raged with all its fierce intensity, but inside their cabin, warmth and love were creating something that would endure long after the snows melted and the harsh season passed into memory. January brought the heart of winter to Wyoming territory, with temperatures that made the previous month's cold seem mild by comparison. The snow lay so deep that the familiar landmarks of the homestead were transformed into alien shapes, and the wind carried a bite that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Yet inside the McCrae cabin, warmth and contentment reigned as Eleanor and Levi settled into the deep rhythms of winter life. Eleanor's pregnancy had advanced to the stage where every movement required careful consideration. The baby seemed to have grown enormously in recent weeks, making sleep nearly impossible and simple tasks like cooking or mending almost beyond her capabilities. But rather than feeling burdened or helpless, she found herself marveling at how seamlessly Levi had stepped into the role of caregiver and domestic partner. He had learned to cook with surprising skill, taking over not just the physical demands of meal preparation, but showing genuine interest in creating nourishing, appealing food. Eleanor often watched from Samuel's chair as Levi moved around the kitchen with quiet competence, stirring soups, baking bread, and somehow managing to produce meals that rivaled her own cooking despite his limited experience. "Where did you learn to do that?" Eleanor asked one afternoon, as Levi presented her with a perfectly browned loaf of bread and a bowl of rich stew that filled the cabin with wonderful aromas. "Watching you," Levi replied simply, "and my father used to say that any skill worth doing was worth doing well, so I pay attention." But it was the small gestures that touched Eleanor most deeply, the way Levi would warm her shawl by the fire before bringing it to her, his habit of making sure she always had fresh water within reach, the gentle way he would help her stand when the weight of the baby made it difficult to rise from her chair. He seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what she needed, often addressing her discomfort before she had to ask for help. One particularly difficult night, Eleanor woke to severe cramping that sent waves of pain through her abdomen and back. She lay in bed for nearly an hour, trying to determine whether this was normal pregnancy discomfort or something more serious, before finally calling out for Levi. He appeared in her doorway within moments, fully dressed as if he had been awake and alert. "What is it? Is it time?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, fear creeping into her voice. "Something feels different. Wrong, maybe." Without hesitation, Levi moved to her bedside and helped her sit up, his hands gentle but steady. "Tell me what you're feeling." Eleanor described the pain and her concerns, watching Levi's face in the lamplight as he processed the information with the same careful attention he brought to everything important. Rather than panicking or dismissing her fears, he asked practical questions about timing, intensity, and other symptoms. "I think we should get you more comfortable and keep watch," he said finally. "If this is early labor, we need to be ready. If it's something else, we'll deal with that too." For the next several hours, Levi remained at Eleanor's side, helping her find positions that eased the pain, preparing warm compresses for her back, and monitoring her condition with a calm attentiveness that surprised them both. He had somehow absorbed all of Eleanor's lessons about childbirth and was applying that knowledge with steady competence. "You don't have to stay," Eleanor said during a brief lull in the discomfort. "You need your sleep." "I'm staying," Levi replied firmly. "You shouldn't be alone with this." As dawn approached, the cramping gradually subsided, leaving Eleanor exhausted but relieved. The crisis, whatever it had been, seemed to have passed without serious consequences. "Thank you," she said as Levi helped her settle back into bed. "I don't know what I would have done without you here." "You would have managed," Levi said with quiet confidence. "You're stronger than you know, but I'm glad you didn't have to find out." The incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Eleanor realized that she had come to depend on Levi not just for practical assistance, but for emotional support during the most vulnerable time of her life. More importantly, she recognized that his care for her went far beyond obligation or even affectionate, had become the protective love of family, genuine and unshakable. Levi, for his part, seemed to have found his purpose in caring for Eleanor and preparing for the baby's arrival. She often found him studying the medical books by lamplight after she had gone to bed, taking notes on complications that might arise and remedies that could help. His determination to be ready for any emergency was both touching and reassuring. Their evening conversations during this period took on a different quality, more intimate and reflective, as they contemplated the approaching birth and the changes it would bring to their lives. Eleanor had begun sharing more personal memories of her childhood and marriage, while Levi revealed more about his dreams for the future beyond mere survival. "I've been thinking about education," Levi said one evening as they worked together on the baby quilt, now nearly completed and beautiful in its intricate pattern of interlocking rings. "Not just reading and arithmetic, but real education. Maybe someday I could learn enough to teach others or to help run a school. Eleanor looked up from her stitching, struck by the ambition in his voice. That's a wonderful goal. You have the mind for it, and the patience. Do you really think so? Levi asked, and Eleanor could hear both hope and uncertainty in his question. I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Eleanor replied honestly. You've already proven that you can learn quickly and apply knowledge practically. More importantly, you understand what it's like to be denied opportunities, which would make you a compassionate teacher. The idea seemed to energize Levi, and over the following weeks, Eleanor noticed him paying even closer attention to his reading, asking more questions about grammar and mathematics, and showing genuine curiosity about subjects beyond their immediate needs. She began incorporating more advanced lessons into their evening routine, sharing what she knew about history, geography, and literature. Tell me about the world beyond Wyoming territory, Levi said one night, as they studied a map that had belonged to Samuel. What are the big cities like? What do people do there? Eleanor described her memories of eastern cities from her youth, the bustling streets, the variety of occupations, the schools and libraries and theaters that provided opportunities for learning and culture. She could see Levi absorbing these descriptions with fascination, building a mental picture of possibilities that extended far beyond the isolated homestead. Do you ever think about leaving here? He asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Sometimes I wonder what opportunities this baby will have, growing up so far from schools and other children. But this is home, Levi. This is what Samuel and I built together, and it's where I want to raise my child. Our child, Levi corrected gently, then looked surprised at his own words. Eleanor felt her heart warm at the correction. Our child, she agreed, reaching over to cover his hand with hers. Among Samuel's possessions, Eleanor had discovered a collection of pressed wildflowers that he had preserved in his Bible-delicate specimens of prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, and mountain laurel that he had gathered during their early years on the homestead. She had found them after his death, each one carefully labeled with the date and location where he had found it, and she had been touched by this evidence of his appreciation for beauty in their harsh environment. Look at this, she said one evening, showing Levi the pressed flowers. Samuel never told me he was collecting these. Levi examined the delicate specimens with reverence, his artist's eye appreciating both their natural beauty and the care with which they had been preserved. He was creating something permanent from moments of beauty, he observed. Like your quilting or my carving. I think you're right, Eleanor agreed. He was preserving hope reminders that even in the hardest times, there's still beauty in the world. They decided to continue Samuel's tradition, planning to gather wildflowers with the baby when spring came, teaching the child to notice and appreciate the small wonders that surrounded them. The pressed flowers became a symbol of continuity, connecting past and future through shared appreciation for the gifts that life offered, even in challenging circumstances. As February approached and Eleanor's pregnancy entered its final weeks, both she and Levi felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the approaching birth. They had prepared as thoroughly as possible. Supplies were ready, procedures had been studied and discussed, and contingency plans had been made for various complications that might arise. Are you frightened? Eleanor asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands resting on her belly where the baby moved restlessly. Terrified, Levi admitted honestly, but also excited and determined to do everything right. That's exactly how I feel, Eleanor said with a smile. I suppose that means we're as ready as anyone can be. Outside their cabin, the Wyoming winter continued its relentless grip on the land, but inside, warmth and love were preparing to welcome new life into the world. The family that Eleanor and Levi had built through choice, rather than blood, was about to expand, and both of them understood that their lives were about to change in ways they could barely imagine. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as they had faced everything else, since that autumn day when Eleanor had decided to rescue a boy in need and discovered that she was saving herself as well. March arrived with the first tentative hints that winter's grip on Wyoming territory might finally be loosening. The snow had begun to settle and compact rather than accumulate, and occasionally the wind carried scents that suggested earth and growing things rather than just ice and emptiness. Eleanor's pregnancy had reached the stage where the baby seemed ready to arrive at any moment, her body heavy and uncomfortable, but filled with the restless energy that indicated birth was near. Levi had become increasingly protective as Eleanor's time approached, rarely leaving the cabin for longer than necessary, and always ensuring that everything needed for the birth was within easy reach. He had studied the medical books so thoroughly that Eleanor sometimes joked he knew more about childbirth than many trained midwives. But his dedication to being prepared gave her confidence that they could handle whatever complications might arise. On a morning when the sun showed enough strength to begin melting the icicles hanging from the cabin's eaves, their peaceful routine was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Eleanor looked up from her breakfast, immediately alert to the unusual nature of the sound, multiple riders moving at speed, not the leisurely pace of neighbors making a social call. Levi was already moving toward the window, his body tense with the wariness that had become second nature during his years in Copper Ridge. 3 men, he reported quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward Samuel's rifle. I don't recognize them. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Unexpected visitors in isolated country often brought trouble, and her condition made her particularly vulnerable to any kind of threat. What do they want? Before Levi could answer, a harsh voice called out from the yard. Levi Thornton, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible, and nobody needs to get hurt. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice at the words, but it was the expression on Levi's face that truly frightened her. All the color had drained from his features, and his eyes held the same trapped look she remembered from their first meeting in Copper Ridge. Whatever these men wanted, Levi knew exactly why they were here. What is it? Eleanor whispered, struggling to rise from her chair. Levi, what's happening? Levi's hands were shaking as he reached for the rifle, but Eleanor could see the defeat in his posture. They're here for me, he said quietly. I should have known this would happen eventually. What are you talking about? Eleanor demanded, fear making her voice sharper than she intended. The voice outside called again, more impatiently this time. Thornton, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've got warrants, and we're not leaving without you. Levi closed his eyes briefly, then turned to face Eleanor with an expression of profound regret. There's something I never told you, he said. Something that happened right before you found me in Copper Ridge. I'm wanted by the law. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her as the implications of his words sank in. Wanted for what? Robbery and assault, Levi said, his voice barely audible. At least, that's what they're calling it. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, as if responding to Eleanor's emotional distress. She pressed her hand to her side, trying to process this revelation while managing her physical discomfort. The young man she had come to love and trust like a son was a wanted criminal, and armed law enforcement officers were outside her door demanding his surrender. Tell me what really happened, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Levi looked toward the window where the silhouettes of the waiting men were visible against the snow. There was a girl, he began, his voice heavy with old pain. Sarah Miller, barely 14. Her stepfather had been, he stopped, unable to say the words directly. He'd been hurting her. Everyone in town knew it, but nobody would do anything because he owned one of the bigger claims and had money to throw around. Eleanor felt sick understanding flood through her, but she remained silent, letting Levi tell his story. One night I heard her screaming from their cabin. Her mother was passed out drunk, and he was. Levi's hands clenched into fists. I couldn't just walk away. I broke down their door and pulled him off her. We fought, and I hit him with a poker from their fireplace. He went down hard. And then, Eleanor prompted gently. Sarah was terrified, bleeding, barely conscious. I took what money I could find in their cabin, maybe $40, and got her out of there. I was planning to take her to the territorial authorities, somewhere she could be safe. Levi's voice grew bitter, but her stepfather came to before we could get far. He told the sheriff I'd robbed him and tried to rape his stepdaughter, said I attacked him when he tried to stop me. Eleanor felt her heart breaking for the impossible situation Levi had faced. What happened to Sarah? Her stepfather moved her away the next day, said she was too traumatized to speak to anyone. The sheriff was more interested in collecting the reward her stepfather offered than investigating the truth. Levi turned to face Eleanor fully. I've been running ever since. I thought I was safe here. Thought maybe they'd given up looking for me. The wanted poster that one of the men outside pulled from his coat was crumpled and weather-beaten, but Eleanor could see Levi's description clearly enough. Wanted for robbery and aggravated assault. 100 reward. Dangerous. Approach with caution. Eleanor's mind raced as she processed everything Levi had told her. This wasn't the story of a criminal who had deceived her. This was the story of a young man who had risked everything to protect a helpless child and was now being punished for his courage. "Thornton," the voice outside called again. "We're losing patience. Come out now or we're coming in." "I have to go with them," Levi said quietly, moving toward the door. "I won't have them forcing their way in here, especially with you so close to giving birth." "No," Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You're not going anywhere." Levi stared at her. "Eleanor, you don't understand. They have legal authority. If I don't surrender, they'll arrest you for harboring a fugitive." "Let me worry about that," Eleanor replied, her mind already working through possibilities. "How long ago did this happen?" 2 years, Levi said, "maybe a little more." Eleanor nodded grimly. 2 years was long enough for witnesses to disappear, for memories to fade, for evidence to become questionable. But it was also long enough for a scared 14-year-old girl to become a young woman who might be willing to tell the truth. "Mrs. McCrae," a new voice called from outside. "We know you're in there too. We just want to talk. Nobody needs to get hurt here." Eleanor moved carefully to the window, her pregnancy making her movements slow and deliberate. She could see 3 men on horseback, all wearing badges and carrying weapons. They looked cold, tired, and impatient men who had ridden a long way to collect their bounty and wanted to get the job done. "What do you want with Levi Thornton?" she called through the window. "He's wanted for robbery and assault in Copper Ridge," the apparent leader replied. "We have warrants for his arrest." "On whose authority?" "Territorial Marshal's office. Look, ma'am, this doesn't have to involve you. Just send the boy out and we'll be on our way." Eleanor felt the baby shift restlessly inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and emotional distress. But alongside the fear, she felt something else, Rizinga, fierce, protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. This young man had become her family, and she would not allow him to be taken without a fight. "I need to see those warrants," she called back. "Ma'am, you're not a law enforcement officer. You don't have any right to examine official documents. This is my property, and Levi Thornton is my employee." Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with frontier bureaucracy before. "Wyoming territorial law gives me the right to examine any warrant before it's executed on my land." She heard muffled conversation among the men outside, clearly frustrated by her knowledge of territorial law. Finally, the leader called back, "All right, one of us will bring the papers to your door, but any tricks and we'll take both of you in." Eleanor turned to Levi, who was watching her with amazement and growing hope. "Get the rifle," she said quietly. "Not to fight them, but so they know we're prepared to defend ourselves if necessary." "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Levi whispered. "I'm protecting my family," Eleanor replied simply. "Now help me get to the door. I want to see exactly what kind of authority these men think they have." The deputy who approached the cabin was young and nervous, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. When Eleanor opened the door with Levi standing behind her, rifle in hand but not threatening, the young man's eyes widened at her obvious pregnancy. "Ma'am, maybe you should just let us handle this," he said uncertainly. "The warrants," Eleanor said firmly, holding out her hand. The deputy handed over the documents with obvious reluctance. Eleanor examined them carefully, her experience as a seamstress for government officials having taught her to read legal documents with a critical eye. What she found made her heart race with possibility. The warrants were valid, but they were also nearly 2 years old. More importantly, they were issued by a local sheriff rather than territorial authorities, and they contained several procedural irregularities that might make them questionable in a territorial court. "These warrants are from Sheriff Morrison in Copper Ridge," Eleanor said loudly enough for all 3 men to hear. "They're not territorial warrants, and they're nearly 2 years old. What gives you the authority to execute them here?" "We're bounty hunters working under contract with the Territorial Marshal's office," the deputy replied, his confidence visibly shaking. "Then you should have territorial documentation authorizing your actions," Eleanor said. "I don't see any such paperwork here." The conversation that followed was tense and complex, with Eleanor using every bit of legal knowledge she possessed to challenge the men's authority, while Levi watched in amazement at her fierce defense of him. She demanded to see proof of their bounty hunting licenses, questioned the jurisdiction of local warrants in territorial matters, and repeatedly emphasized that any arrest on her property would need to follow proper legal procedures. "Look, lady," the leader finally said, his patience clearly exhausted, "we've ridden a long way to collect this bounty. We're not leaving empty-handed." "Then you'll have to take me as well," Eleanor said calmly, "because I'm not allowing you to remove anyone from my property without proper territorial authorization." The standoff that followed lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eleanor could see the men conferring among themselves, clearly frustrated by the legal complications she had introduced. Finally, they seemed to reach a decision. "We'll be back," the leader called out, "with proper paperwork and territorial backup. Don't think this is over." As the 3 men rode away, Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief and delayed fear. Levi caught her arm, helping her to a chair, as the full magnitude of what had just happened settled over both of them. "You just bought us some time," Levi said quietly. "But they'll be back, and next time they'll have everything they need to take me legally." Eleanor nodded, her hand moving to her belly where the baby was kicking frantically in response to her stress. "Then we need to use that time wisely," she said. "We need to find Sarah Miller and get her to tell the truth about what really happened." The silver locket that Levi pulled from his small bundle of possessions contained a photograph of a young girl with dark hair and serious eyes, Sarah Miller, the child he had risked everything to protect. He had carried it for 2 years, both as a reminder of why he had acted and as hope that someday he might be able to ensure her safety. "She was so scared," Levi said softly, looking at the photograph. "She begged me not to let him hurt her anymore. How could I have done anything else?" Eleanor studied the photograph, seeing in the girl's face the innocence that Levi had been willing to sacrifice his freedom to protect. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, "and now we're going to make sure the world knows it." The crisis had revealed something fundamental about the bond between Eleanor and Levi when faced with the possibility of losing him. Eleanor had discovered that her love for this young man ran deeper than she had realized. He wasn't just her employee or even her friend, he had become her son in every way that mattered, and she would fight with everything she had to protect him. But as her pregnancy pains began again that evening, stronger and more regular than before, Eleanor realized that time was running out in more ways than one. The baby was coming, and when it arrived, their family would be complete if they could keep it together long enough for that miracle to occur. The contractions that began that evening were different from any of the false alarms Eleanor had experienced during the previous weeks. These came with a regularity and intensity that spoke of the baby's determination to finally make its entrance into the world. As the hours passed and the pains grew stronger, Eleanor realized that her child had chosen the worst possible moment to arrive, just as the greatest crisis of their new family's existence was unfolding. "How far apart are they now?" Levi asked, consulting the pocket watch that had belonged to Samuel as he timed Eleanor's contractions with the focused attention of someone who understood that lives might depend on his accuracy. "Every 8 minutes, Eleanor gasped as another wave of pain gripped her. "They're getting stronger too." Levi's face was tight with concentration as he helped Eleanor find a more comfortable position in the bed they had prepared for the birth. Despite the gravity of their legal situation, he seemed determined to focus entirely on the immediate crisis of bringing a baby safely into the world. "Should I try to get word to Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, though they both knew that the 3-mile journey through March snow could take hours, and there was no guarantee that Eleanor's neighbor would be able to provide more assistance than Levi could. "No," Eleanor decided. "You've studied everything as carefully as any midwife. We can do this ourselves." But even as she spoke, Eleanor couldn't help wondering if they would be allowed to remain a family long enough to see her child grow up. The bounty hunter's promise to return with proper documentation weighed heavily on her mind, adding emotional stress to the physical demands of labor. Levi seemed to sense her troubled thoughts. "Don't worry about anything except bringing this baby safely into the world," he said gently. "Whatever happens with those men, we'll face it together. But right now, your only job is to focus on becoming a mother." His calm confidence helped steady Eleanor's nerves, and she found herself marveling at how much the frightened young man she had rescued from Copper Ridge had grown in strength and maturity. The crisis with the bounty hunters had revealed reserves of courage and determination in both of them that surprised even themselves. As the night wore on and Eleanor's labor progressed, Levi proved himself to be an excellent birth attendant. He had absorbed every lesson from the medical books, anticipating her needs and responding to complications with steady competence. When Eleanor's water broke in the early hours of the morning, he was ready with clean linens and warm water. When her pain became nearly unbearable, he helped her find positions that provided relief and encouraged her with quiet words of support. "You're doing beautifully," he told her during a brief respite between contractions. "The baby's going to be here soon." Eleanor gripped his hand tightly as another pain began to build. "Levi, promise me something," she said urgently. "Anything. If those men come back if something happens to me during the birth, promise me you'll take the baby and run. Don't let them separate you from our child." Levi's eyes filled with tears at her words, but his voice was firm when he replied, "Nothing's going to happen to you. You're going to deliver this baby safely, and we're going to raise him or her together. I promise you that." The intensity of Eleanor's labor increased dramatically as dawn approached, and Levi found himself facing the moment he had both prepared for and dreaded. The medical books had given him theoretical knowledge, but the reality of helping someone he loved through the dangerous process of childbirth tested every ounce of his courage and skill. "I can see the baby's head," he announced, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "You're almost there, Eleanor." The final stage of labor seemed to last forever, and no time at all. Eleanor pushed with strength she didn't know she possessed, while Levi guided their child into the world, with hands that shook, despite his efforts to remain calm. When the baby finally slipped free with a rush of fluid and blood, Levi caught the tiny, slippery form with a reverence that bordered on worship. "It's a boy," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "A perfect, beautiful boy." Thomas Samuel McCrae announced his arrival with a lusty cry that filled the cabin with the sound of new life. As Levi cleaned the baby and wrapped him in the soft blankets Eleanor had prepared, both adults found themselves crying with relief, joy, and the overwhelming love that seemed to expand to fill every corner of their small world. "Let me see him," Eleanor said weakly, reaching out with trembling arms to receive her son. Levi placed the baby carefully in Eleanor's arms, then knelt beside the bed to study the miracle they had brought into being together. Thomas was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at his mother with ancient wisdom. "Hello, my little fighter," Eleanor whispered, echoing Samuel's words from months before. "Welcome to the world." The silver locket containing Sarah Miller's photograph lay on the bedside table, a reminder of the crisis that still awaited resolution. But for this precious moment, as Eleanor nursed her newborn son and Levi watched over both of them with protective devotion, their family felt complete and unshakable. "He's beautiful," Levi said softly, reaching out to touch one tiny, perfect hand. "He looks like you." "He looks like himself," Eleanor replied with a tired smile. like the person he's meant to become. The peaceful aftermath of the birth was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not the three bounty hunters this time, but a larger group that included the unmistakable authority of territorial officials. Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized their brief respite was over. "They're back," Levi said grimly, moving to the window to assess the situation. "More of them this time, and they look official." Eleanor struggled to sit up in bed, her body still weak from childbirth, but her mind sharp with determination. "Help me get dressed," she said. "I won't meet them lying down like an invalid." "Eleanor, you just gave birth. You need to rest." "What I need is to protect my family," Eleanor replied firmly. "And that includes you, whether those men understand it or not." As Levi helped Eleanor into a clean dress and arranged pillows so she could hold Thomas while receiving their unwelcome visitors, both of them felt the weight of everything they had built together hanging in the balance. The family they had created through choice and love was about to face its greatest test. The group that assembled in their small cabin included the original three bounty hunters, a territorial deputy marshal, and, to Eleanor's surprise, a middle-aged woman whose travel-worn appearance suggested she had come a long distance to be here. "Mrs. McCrae," the deputy marshal said respectfully, his eyes taking in her obvious postpartum condition and the newborn in her arms. "I apologize for the timing of this visit, but we have legal matters that require immediate attention." "I understand," Eleanor replied calmly, though her arms tightened protectively around Thomas. "What can I help you with?" "We're here for Levi Thornton," the marshal continued. "We have proper territorial warrants for his arrest on charges of robbery and aggravated assault." Eleanor studied the new warrants carefully, noting that they had indeed addressed the legal deficiencies she had identified in the previous documents. These were properly issued and fully authorized, leaving little room for the kind of procedural challenges she had raised before. "Before you execute those warrants," Eleanor said quietly, "I think you should listen to what this lady has to say." She gestured toward the middle-aged woman, who had been standing silently near the door. The woman stepped forward, her expression a mixture of determination and long-suppressed pain. "My name is Margaret Miller," she said in a clear voice. "Sarah Miller is my daughter, and I have something to say about what really happened in Copper Ridge 2 years ago." The silence that followed this announcement was electric with possibility. Levi's face went white with hope and fear, while the law enforcement officers exchanged uncertain glances. Eleanor felt her heart racing as she realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Margaret Miller reached into her travel bag and pulled out a letter written in a young woman's careful handwriting. "This is Sarah's testimony about what happened the night Levi Thornton saved her from my husband," she said firmly, "and I'm here to swear that every word of it is true." The revelation that would change everything was finally at hand, but as Thomas stirred restlessly in Eleanor's arms and Levi stood frozen between hope and despair, no one could predict whether justice would prevail or whether their fragile family would be torn apart by the forces of law and prejudice that had already caused so much suffering. Margaret Miller's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her daughter's letter, but her voice remained steady as she began to read the testimony that would either vindicate Levi or condemn him forever. The territorial deputy marshal listened with growing attention, while the bounty hunters shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that their profitable enterprise was about to become considerably more complicated. "My name is Sarah Miller, and I am 16 years old." Margaret read, "I am writing this to tell the truth about what happened the night of September 15th, 2 years ago, when a young man named Levi Thornton saved my life." Eleanor felt Thomas stir in her arms as her own heart rate increased with tension and hope. Beside the bed, Levi stood motionless, barely breathing as he listened to the words that might restore his freedom and reputation. Margaret continued reading in a voice that grew stronger with each sentence. "My stepfather, Dale Morrison, had been hurting me for months. He would come to my room when my mother was passed out from drinking, and he would—" Margaret's voice faltered briefly before she continued. "He would do things to me that I knew were wrong, but I was too scared to tell anyone, because he said he would kill my mother if I ever spoke about it." The deputy marshal's expression had grown increasingly grim as the true nature of the situation became clear. Even the bounty hunters seemed uncomfortable now, realizing that they might have been pursuing a hero rather than a criminal. That night was worse than usual, Margaret read on. He had been drinking heavily and was angry about something at his mining claim. When he came to my room, he was violent in a way he had never been before. I thought he was going to kill me. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping someone might help, but our nearest neighbors were far away and my mother was unconscious. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she imagined the terror that young Sarah must have experienced. The idea that anyone could harm a child in such a way filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. Then Levi Thornton broke down our door, Margaret continued. He pulled my stepfather off me and fought with him to protect me. When my stepfather fell and hit his head, Levi didn't run away like he could have. Instead, he helped me get dressed and gathered some money from my stepfather's strongbox because he said we would need it to get me somewhere safe. The territorial deputy marshal held up a hand, stopping Margaret's reading. Mrs. Miller, are you prepared to swear under oath that this testimony is accurate? I am, Margaret replied firmly, and I'm prepared to explain why my daughter wasn't able to give this testimony 2 years ago when it might have prevented this injustice. Eleanor watched the faces of the law enforcement officers as they processed this information. She could see doubt creeping into their expressions, the certainty of Levi's guilt being replaced by questions about the true nature of what had happened in Copper Ridge. Continue with the letter, the deputy marshal instructed. Margaret resumed reading. Levi was trying to take me to the territorial authorities in Cheyenne when my stepfather caught up with us. He told lies to the sheriff, saying that Levi had robbed him and tried to hurt me. When the sheriff asked me what happened, my stepfather threatened to kill my mother if I told the truth. I was only 14 and terrified, so I stayed silent while they called Levi a criminal. The silence in the cabin was profound as the implications of Sarah's testimony sank in. Levi had been branded a fugitive, not for committing a crime, but for preventing Anand, a vulnerable child, had been forced to remain silent while her protector was pursued by the law. Where is Sarah now? The deputy marshal asked. Living with my sister in Colorado Territory, Margaret replied, safe from her stepfather for the first time in years. When she turned 16 last month, she finally felt strong enough to write down what really happened. She made me promise to find Levi Thornton and make sure the truth was told. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward the young woman who had found the courage to vindicate the man who had risked everything to protect her. At the same time, she tore a strip of fabric from her wedding dress, the dress she had worn to marry Samuelto, used as a bandage for Thomas, who had developed a small scratch during his difficult birth. The symbolic sacrifice of her past, for her present family, felt appropriate as they fought to secure their future together. This is all very interesting, the lead bounty hunter interrupted, but it doesn't change the fact that we have legal warrants for this man's arrest. What some girl claims happened 2 years ago doesn't override official documentation. The deputy marshal turned to face the bounty hunter with an expression of growing displeasure. Actually, it does. If this testimony is accurate, then the original charges were based on false information, which makes the warrants themselves invalid. You can't just take some woman's word for it, the bounty hunter protested. We've got legal documents signed by a territorial judge. Documents based on a complaint from a man who was sexually abusing his stepdaughter. The deputy marshal replied coldly. If that's the case, then this entire situation has been a miscarriage of justice from the beginning. Eleanor watched this exchange with growing hope, but she could also see that the bounty hunters were not prepared to give up their prize easily. They had invested time and money in tracking Levi down, and they clearly expected to be compensated for their efforts, regardless of his actual guilt or innocence. Look, the second bounty hunter said, his hand moving meaningfully toward his weapon. We've come a long way for this bounty. We're not leaving empty-handed just because some story changes. The threat implicit in his words changed the atmosphere in the cabin immediately. Levi tensed, moving closer to Eleanor and the baby in a protective gesture, while the deputy marshal's hand moved to his own sidearm. "Are you threatening a territorial law enforcement officer?" the deputy marshal asked quietly. The bounty hunter seemed to realize he had overplayed his hand, but his companions were nodding in agreement with his position. Eleanor could see that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge, ready to explode into violence that could endanger everyone in the room, including her newborn son. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, despite her current physical vulnerability. "You're in my home, and I've just given birth to my son. If you want to settle your disputes about jurisdiction and proper procedures, I suggest you do it outside, where you won't be threatening a woman and newborn child." Her words seemed to shame the men into remembering basic civility, and the immediate tension in the room decreased slightly. But Eleanor could see that the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. The bounty hunters still wanted their money. The deputy marshal was questioning the validity of their warrants, and Levi's fate hung in the balance. "There's one more thing," Margaret Miller said quietly, reaching into her bag again. "Something that might help settle this matter definitively." She pulled out a second document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. "This is a deposition from Dr. Harrison Wells, the territorial physician who examined Sarah after we finally escaped from her stepfather 6 months ago. His medical findings confirmed that she had been sexually abused for an extended period of time, exactly as she described in her testimony." The deputy marshal examined the medical document carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he read the physician's clinical but damning conclusions. When he looked up, his face was set with the determination of a man who had seen enough evidence to reach a clear conclusion. "Based on this testimony and supporting documentation," he announced formally, "I am declaring the warrants for Levi Thornton's arrest to be invalid due to false information in the original complaint. Mr. Thornton is free to go, and any attempt to detain him without proper cause will be considered kidnapping under territorial law." The bounty hunters erupted in angry protests, but their objections were overruled by the deputy marshal's authority. As the heated argument continued around them, Eleanor felt overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. Their family was safe. Thomas would grow up with both his mother and the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. Levi knelt beside Eleanor's bed, tears streaming down his face as he gently touched Thomas's tiny hand. "It's over," he whispered. "We're really going to be a family." Eleanor smiled through her own tears, understanding that this moment represented not just legal vindication for Levi, but the true beginning of their life together as a complete family unit. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, mother, father, and child, united by love and choice rather than just blood and circumstance. The confrontation between the deputy marshal and the bounty hunters continued for several more tense minutes, but Eleanor could see that the legal tide had turned decisively in Levi's favor. The combination of Sarah Miller's detailed testimony and the supporting medical evidence had created a compelling case that the original charges were not only false, but had been filed by the very man who had committed the crimes Levi was accused of. "I don't care what some doctor wrote," the lead bounty hunter declared angrily. "We have legal warrants, and we're entitled to our compensation." "Your warrants are based on fraudulent charges," the deputy marshal replied with finality. "Not only are you not entitled to compensation, but continuing to pursue this matter could result in charges against you for harassment and unlawful detention." As the argument reached its crescendo, Thomas began crying in Eleanor's arms, perhaps responding to the raised voices and tension in the room, or simply expressing the normal needs of a newborn who was hungry and overwhelmed by his new environment. Eleanor tried to soothe him, but her own emotional state made it difficult to provide the calm presence he needed. Levi immediately moved to help, gently taking Thomas from Eleanor's arms and walking slowly around the room while humming a soft tune. To everyone's surprise, the baby quieted almost immediately, seeming to find comfort in Levi's steady presence and gentle voice. "Look at that," Margaret Miller said softly, watching Levi care for the newborn with natural skill and obvious affection. That young man has the heart of a father. Her words seemed to crystallize something for the deputy marshal, who had been observing the domestic scene with growing understanding. "Mrs. McCrae," he said respectfully, "is Levi Thornton the father of your child?" Eleanor felt a moment of confusion at the question before she realized what the marshal was trying to understand. "Not by blood," she said clearly, "but in every other way that matters, yes. Levi is this baby's father, and Thomas is his son." The simple declaration seemed to complete the transformation of how the law enforcement officers viewed the situation. Instead of a fugitive hiding out with an unsuspecting woman, they now saw a family unit that had been threatened by a miscarriage of justice based on the lies of a child abuser. "Well then," the deputy marshal said with satisfaction, "I think this matter is settled. Mr. Thornton, you are free of all charges related to the Copper Ridge incident. These gentlemen," he gestured toward the bounty hunters, "will be leaving your property immediately and will not return." The bounty hunters made one final attempt to salvage their situation, threatening to appeal to higher authorities and demanding compensation for their wasted time and effort. But their protests fell on deaf ears as the deputy marshal made it clear that any further harassment of the McCrae family would result in serious legal consequences for them. As the unwelcome visitors prepared to leave, Margaret Miller approached Eleanor's bedside with a small package in her hands. "This is from Sarah," she said gently. "She wanted Levi to have it as a token of her gratitude." Inside the package was a simple but beautifully embroidered handkerchief with a note written in the same careful handwriting as the testimony that had saved Levi's freedom. "For the man who saved my life and taught me that there are still heroes in the world, thank you for your courage, Sarah Miller." Levi read the note with tears in his eyes, then carefully folded both the handkerchief and the letter. "Please tell her," he said to Margaret, "that knowing she's safe and happy is all the thanks I need, and tell her that she's braver than she knows for finding the courage to tell the truth." Margaret nodded, her own eyes bright with emotion. "I will. And Mr. Thornton," she paused, searching for the right words. "What you did for my daughter, the sacrifice you made and the price you paid, we'll never forget it. You're a good man, and you deserve the happiness you found here." After the visitors had departed and the cabin had returned to its peaceful quiet, Eleanor, Levi, and Thomas finally had their first moments as a legally protected family. The crisis that had threatened to tear them apart had instead strengthened their bonds and confirmed what they had known in their hearts, that family was defined not by blood or law, but by love, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice for each other. "It's really over," Levi said wonderingly, still holding Thomas as the baby slept peacefully in his arms. "I can stop looking over my shoulder. I can stop worrying about being taken away from you. We're free to build our future together," Eleanor agreed, feeling exhausted but deeply content. "All three of us." As evening approached and they settled into their first night as an officially complete family, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a lonely widow facing the prospect of single motherhood in isolation. Now she was part of a family unit that had been tested by crisis and emerged stronger than ever. The child's testimony letter, carefully preserved among their precious documents, would serve as a permanent reminder of the price that had been paid for their happiness and the courage that had been required to secure their freedom. Sarah Miller's words had not only cleared Levi's name, but had also validated Eleanor's faith in his character and her decision to bring him into their family. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked, as Levi gently placed the sleeping Thomas in the cradle he had built during the winter months. "Now that you're truly free to make your own choices about the future?" Levi considered the question seriously, looking around the cabin that had become his first real home and at the woman and child who had become his family. "I want to stay here," he said simply. "I want to help you raise Thomas, to work this land, to build something lasting and good. If you'll have me." "Always," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "This is your home, Levi. We're your family, Nothing will ever change that. The baby stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds of a newborn beginning to wake. Levi moved immediately to check on him, adjusting his blankets and speaking in the gentle voice that seemed to come naturally when he addressed the child. "Hello, little Thomas," he whispered. "You're safe now. We're all safe now." Eleanor watched this tender scene with a heart full of gratitude and love. The young man who had arrived at her homestead as a broken and frightened fugitive had become a devoted father and partner, someone she trusted completely with the most precious things in her life. The transformation was remarkable, but Eleanor understood that it had been possible only because Levi's essential goodness had never been destroyed by the cruelty he had endured. As the first stars appeared in the clear Wyoming sky, Eleanor felt a deep sense of completion and rightness about their situation. They had faced the worst that circumstances could throw at them and had emerged not just intact but stronger. Their family had been tested by forces that might have destroyed a less committed group, but their love for each other had proven unshakable. "Tomorrow, we'll start planning for spring," Eleanor said, as Levi helped her settle more comfortably in bed. "There's so much work to be done, and Thomas will need to be introduced to the neighbors, and—" "Tomorrow," Levi interrupted gently. "We'll rest and be grateful for what we have. The work will wait. The neighbors will be there when we're ready. Right now, all that matters is that we're together." Eleanor smiled at his wisdom, understanding that he was right. After the crisis they had just survived, taking time to appreciate their blessings was not just appropriate, but necessary. They had earned the right to simply exist as a family, without the pressure of external threats or urgent obligations. The final resolution of their legal troubles had cleared the way for them to begin thinking about long-term plans and dreams. Levi's education could continue and expand, perhaps eventually leading to the teaching career he had mentioned. Thomas would grow up in an environment of love and learning, with opportunities that had been denied to his adoptive father. And Eleanor would have the chance to raise her child with the support and partnership she had always dreamed of. As the night deepened and the three members of their family settled into sleep, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the mysterious workings of Providence that had brought them together. What had begun as a simple act of charity rescuing a boy from an abusive situation had evolved into something far richer and more meaningful. They had saved each other in ways that went beyond mere physical rescue, creating bonds that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The handkerchief that Sarah Miller had embroidered for Levi lay on the bedside table, a tangible reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had made their happiness possible. Her written testimony had not only freed Levi from false accusations, but had also demonstrated the power of truth to overcome injustice, even when that truth had been suppressed by fear and intimidation. Eleanor's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer of thanksgiving for the family that had been given to her in her greatest time of need, and a promise to cherish and protect the love that had transformed three separate lives into something beautiful and whole. 1 year later, the McCrae homestead buzzed with the sounds of celebration as neighbors gathered to mark Thomas's first birthday. The Wyoming spring had arrived early that year, filling the prairie with wildflowers and the promise of a prosperous growing season. Eleanor stood on her front porch, watching as Levi demonstrated his woodworking skills to a group of admiring children, while Thomas toddled around the yard with the confident determination of a child who had never known anything but love and security. The transformation in their lives over the past year had been remarkable. Thomas had grown into a healthy, happy baby who clearly adored both his mother and the man he called Papa with equal enthusiasm. Levi had embraced fatherhood with a devotion that sometimes brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, spending hours each day playing with Thomas, teaching him simple words, and crafting toys that delighted the child and impressed the neighbors with their artistry. "That boy of yours is getting big," Martha Henderson observed, joining Eleanor on the porch with a plate of cookies fresh from the kitchen. "And smart, too. I've never seen a 1-year-old so interested in books." Eleanor smiled proudly as she watched Thomas attempt to read to a group of dolls, holding a picture book upside down but babbling seriously as if delivering a lecture. "Levi reads to him every evening," she explained. "I think Thomas believes that books are some kind of magic, and honestly, I'm not sure he's wrong." The changes in Levi over the past year had been even more dramatic than Thomas's development. The frightened, suspicious young man who had arrived at the homestead had been replaced by someone confident, articulate, and deeply respected in their small community. His natural intelligence, freed from the constraints of survival and fear, had flourished under Eleanor's continued teaching and his own voracious appetite for learning. "Mrs. McCrae," called James Henderson as he approached the porch. "I wanted to thank Levi again for his help with our barn raising last month. That boy has real skill with construction, and he's got a way of explaining things that makes even complicated work seem manageable." Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. Over the past year, Levi had become the person their neighbors turned to when they needed help with projects that required both skill and intelligence. His reputation for honest dealing, hard work, and creative problem-solving had spread throughout their corner of Wyoming territory, bringing him opportunities that would have seemed impossible during his fugitive years. The most significant change, however, was visible in a corner of their main room, where an easel held a charcoal portrait that had become the centerpiece of their home. A traveling artist had visited the previous fall, and Eleanor had commissioned him to capture their family in a formal portrait. The resulting artwork showed Eleanor seated with Thomas on her lap, while Levi stood behind them with his hand resting protectively on Eleanor's shoulder. But it was the expressions on their faces that made the portrait truly special, the look of complete contentment and belonging that spoke of people who had found exactly where they were meant to be. "You know," Eleanor said to Martha as they watched Levi patiently help Thomas navigate the steps down from the porch, "sometimes I think about how different our lives might have been if Jake Morrison hadn't brought me news about a boy in trouble." "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked quietly, "taking such a risk on a complete stranger?" Eleanor considered the question, though she already knew her answer. "Never," she said firmly. "Bringing Levi home was the best decision I ever made, apart from marrying Samuel. This family," she gestured toward her husband and son, still marveling at how natural it felt to think of them in those terms. "This family is exactly what I was meant to have." As the afternoon celebration continued, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of happiness. The legal troubles that had once threatened to tear them apart now seemed like a distant nightmare, resolved so completely that Levi rarely spoke of his years as a fugitive. The territorial authorities had not only cleared his name, but had commended him for his courage in protecting Sarah Miller. And there had even been talk of charging her stepfather with filing false reports, though nothing had come of it due to jurisdictional complications. More importantly, Sarah Miller herself had visited them the previous summer, traveling from Colorado Territory with her aunt to meet the man who had saved her life. The reunion had been emotional for everyone involved, but especially meaningful for Levi, who was able to see that the frightened, damaged child he had risked everything to protect had grown into a confident, healthy young woman with plans to become a teacher herself. "I wanted to see that you were happy," Sarah had told Levi during her visit. "I needed to know that your sacrifice hadn't been wasted, that you had found the good life you deserved." The conversation between them had helped heal wounds that had lingered in Levi's heart since the night he had been forced to flee Copper Ridge. Knowing that Sarah was safe and thriving had given him permission to fully embrace his own happiness without guilt or regret. As the birthday celebration began to wind down and neighbors started making their farewells, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction in the life they had built together. The homestead prospered under Levi's capable management and Eleanor's careful planning, producing enough not only to sustain their family, but to contribute meaningfully to their community. Thomas was growing up, surrounded by love, learning, and the kind of security that would give him the confidence to pursue any dreams he might develop. But perhaps most importantly, They had proven that families could be built on choice and love, rather than just blood and circumstance. The bond between Eleanor and Levi had deepened over the year into something that resembled the relationship between a mother and son, while his devotion to Thomas was indistinguishable from that of any biological father. They had created something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their individual lives. "Papa, up!" Thomas demanded, raising his arms toward Levi as the last of the neighbors departed. Levi immediately complied, lifting the toddler onto his shoulders, where Thomas could survey his domain with the satisfaction of a young prince. "Happy birthday, little man," Levi said, spinning slowly so Thomas could see the entire homestead from his elevated perch. "This is all yours someday if you want it." Eleanor watched this tender scene with a heart full of gratitude and love. The wooden horse that Levi had carved during his first weeks at the homestead sat on Thomas's toy shelf, worn smooth from constant handling, but still treasured as the first gift from the man who had become his father. Beside it sat newer toys, each one crafted with the same love and attention to detail that characterized everything Levi did for his family. As evening approached and they settled into their familiar routine of supper, storytelling, and quiet conversation by the fire, Eleanor reflected on how perfectly their lives had arranged themselves. Thomas babbled happily from his high chair, while Levi prepared a simple meal, and the sounds of domestic contentment filled their home with warmth and peace. "Do you ever wonder what Samuel would think of all this?" Levi asked, as he helped Eleanor settle into her chair with a cup of tea. Eleanor smiled, thinking of her first husband and the love that had sustained her through so many difficult years. "I think he would be proud of what we've built here," she said honestly. Samuel always believed that love was something that grew stronger when it was shared, not weaker. He would be happy to know that Thomas will grow up with two fathers who loved him, who gave him life, and one who chose to make him his own. As the stars appeared in the clear Wyoming sky and their small family prepared for another peaceful night, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a pregnant widow's decision to rescue a boy in need had led them to this moment of perfect contentment, three people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without even knowing it. The family portrait that hung on their wall would serve as a permanent reminder of what they had accomplished together. But the real testament to their success was visible every day in the love, laughter, and security that filled their home. They had proven that sometimes the greatest acts of courage were also the simple stopping your heart to someone in need, and trusting that love would find a way to create something beautiful from even the most difficult circumstances.